My name is Lucas Aaron Whitmore. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been the kind of person people don't really look at twice. Not because I caused problems, not because I demanded attention, but because I fit neatly into a role that made others comfortable, useful, available, and quiet. If you asked the people around me back then who I was, they'd probably say something simple. He helps out. He's reliable. He doesn't need much. I lived in their house. I fixed things when they broke. I paid what I could, filled the gaps where I was needed, and stayed out of the way when I wasn't. Over time, that arrangement started to feel permanent, at least for them. For me, it felt conditional in a way no one ever said out loud. People tend to underestimate you when you don't defend yourself loudly, when you don't correct their assumptions, when you let them believe they understand you completely, because you never interrupt the story they've already written in their heads. I learned that early, and for a long time I accepted it as the price of peace. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not about proving anyone wrong in a dramatic way, and it's not about becoming someone unrecognizable overnight. It's about what happens slowly, quietly, when you realize that the place you're standing in is not the place you're meant to remain, and that no one is going to announce when it's time for you to leave. There was a moment, not loud, not explosive, when I understood that the people around me didn't see me as someone building a future. They saw me as part of the background, something stable enough to lean on, but not solid enough to respect. And once that understanding settled in, I stopped trying to change their minds. Instead, I changed my direction. While they mocked me, casually and indirectly, I built my future in silence. While they assumed I had nowhere else to go, I was quietly learning how not to need permission. And while they believed the house they controlled defined my limits, I was discovering what I could build without them. This story will move slowly, because that's how real change happens. There are no sudden victories here, no perfect speeches, just a sequence of small decisions made without witnesses that eventually became impossible to ignore. I'm telling it now not to expose anyone and not to ask for sympathy. I'm telling it because I know there are people listening who recognize this position, the one where you give more than you're seen, where silence is mistaken for weakness, and where leaving feels riskier than staying. So before we go any further, let me ask you something, gently, without judgment. Have you ever realized that the people closest to you only valued you when you stayed exactly where they placed you? To understand what happened later, you need to understand who I was to them first. Not who I thought I was, but how I existed in their eyes. I wasn't introduced as family. I wasn't introduced as a guest. I wasn't even introduced as temporary. I was introduced through a function. This is Lucas. He helps around the house. No, this is Lucas. He lives with us. Not this is Lucas. He's figuring things out. He helps. And once a person is defined by usefulness, everything else about them becomes optional. At first, it didn't bother me. I told myself I preferred it this way. No expectations meant no pressure meant peace. I was the one who woke up early, fixed the loose hinge, and handled the quiet problems before they became loud ones. I made myself easy to live with because being easy felt safer than being seen. They trusted me with tasks, but not with decisions. They relied on me, but didn't consult me. They appreciated outcomes, not effort, and slowly, subtly, that distinction hardened. Conversations happened around me, not with me. Plans were discussed as if I were furniture, present, useful, but not participating. When something needed to be done, my name came up immediately. When something needed to be decided, it never was. If I'm being honest, I helped train them to see me that way. I rarely pushed back. I nodded. I said no problem, even when it was. I absorbed the inconvenience quietly and told myself it was temporary. I convinced myself that patience would eventually turn into respect. But patience, when misunderstood, often turns into permission. I noticed it in small ways first. A joke that landed a little too comfortably at my expense. A comment about my simple situation. A casual assumption that I'd always be available because, well, what else was I doing? No one said I was failing. They didn't need to. Their tone did the work for them. There's a particular kind of invisibility that comes from being consistently dependable. When you never break, people forget you can feel pressure. When you never complain, they assume there's nothing to complain about. When you don't demand space, they assume you don't need any. I became the person they felt safe overlooking. And the strange part was, on the surface, things looked fine. The house ran smoothly. Conflicts were rare. I wasn't mistreated in any obvious way. But underneath, there was a quiet imbalance growing, one I couldn't quite name yet. I wasn't moving forward in their story. I was maintaining theirs. Every time I thought about doing something different, learning something new, working on my own plans, spending time away, there was an unspoken friction. Not resistance exactly, more like surprise, as if the idea itself didn't fit the version of me they'd settled on. Why? What for? You're good where you are. Those words sound supportive until you realize what they really mean. Stay predictable. I started noticing how often we didn't include me, how often later never came, how often my future was spoken about as if it were small, contained, already decided. And still I stayed quiet, not because I agreed, but because I didn't yet trust myself enough to leave the role I'd mastered. Being invisible had become familiar. Familiar felt safe. Safe felt survivable. What I didn't understand yet was this. Survival and growth rarely coexist in the same place. At that stage, I wasn't angry. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't even disappointed in a clear way. I was something softer and more dangerous, resigned. I accepted their perception of me because challenging it felt like it would cost more than it was worth. I didn't know then that this was the beginning, not of conflict, but of awareness. Because once you see the box someone has placed you in, you can't unsee it. And even if you stay inside for a while longer, something in you has already started measuring the walls. The first moment didn't arrive with any weight to it. No raised voices, no slammed doors. It was so ordinary that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have forgotten it entirely. That's how the small cuts work. They don't announce themselves. It happened on a weekday afternoon. I remember, because the house was unusually quiet. I'd just finished fixing a leak under the sink. Nothing dramatic, just one of those slow drips that becomes a problem if you ignore it long enough. I wiped my hands, stood up, and mentioned, casually, that the pipe would probably need replacing in a few months. One of them looked at me and smiled, not unkindly, just dismissively. "Oh, don't worry about that," they said. "That's the kind of thing we'll handle later. You don't really need to think about long-term stuff like that." They laughed softly after saying it, as if to signal it wasn't serious, as if it were just a harmless comment. No one else reacted. The conversation moved on. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, then nodded and went back to cleaning up. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inside, something registered. It wasn't what they said. It was what they assumed. That long-term thinking wasn't mine to worry about. That I was operating in the present only. That my role stopped at maintenance, not foresight. I didn't challenge it. I didn't correct them. I told myself it wasn't worth reading into. People say things thoughtlessly all the time. I've been telling myself that for years. But later that night, lying in bed, the comment came back to me. Not sharply, more like a dull echo. And when I replayed it, I realized something uncomfortable. No one had asked what I was planning long-term. No one ever had. They talked about renovations, investments, future moves, all around me, without once checking whether I was included in that timeline. I existed in their present tense. Useful now. Undefined later. That was the cut. Small, clean, easy to ignore. After that, I started noticing others like it. Not because they increased suddenly, but because I had become aware enough to see them. A decision was made about the house without mentioning it to me, even though I'd be the one implementing it. A schedule changed, assuming I'd adjust. A conversation about people who don't really have ambition, said lightly, while I was in the room. No one meant harm, I'm certain of that. But meaning well doesn't prevent harm when awareness is missing. What stayed with me wasn't anger, it was clarity. I realized that to them, my silence wasn't interpreted as humility or patience. It was interpreted as confirmation. Confirmation that they understood me fully, that I was content where I was, that I didn't need to be consulted because I had nothing at stake beyond the day-to-day. And the most unsettling part? Everyone else ignored it because it didn't affect them. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being the only one who feels a shift in the air. When something changes subtly in how you're seen, and everyone else keeps moving as if nothing happened, You start questioning your own perception. I asked myself if I was being sensitive, if I were projecting, if this was just pride looking for a reason to be hurt. So I did what I'd always done. I stayed quiet. I told myself that if it mattered, it would happen again in a clearer way. Something unmistakable. Something undeniable. What I didn't understand yet was that clarity rarely arrives all at once. It accumulates. That first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't scar. But it marked the place where my awareness began. From that point on, I started remembering things differently. Comments I'd brushed off before now had context. Patterns I'd ignored started connecting. It wasn't that they suddenly treated me worse. It was that I stopped cushioning the impact with excuses. And once you stop explaining away the behavior of others, you're forced to confront a harder truth. Not everyone is obligated to see you more clearly than you allow yourself to be seen. That night, I wrote something in my notebook, just one line. Pay attention to what people assume you'll tolerate. I didn't know yet where that sentence would lead me. I only knew that something had shifted. Not in them, but in me. And once that happens, the quiet becomes louder than words. Once you notice something once, you can't help but see it again. After that first small cut, nothing dramatic followed. No confrontation, no apology, no escalation. Instead, something more subtle happened. The behavior became routine, and I began participating in my own dismissal without realizing it. Disrespect, when it's quiet, doesn't arrive as cruelty. It arrives as familiarity. It sounded like assumptions were made on my behalf. It looked like decisions were made without checking. It felt like my time being treated as flexible, expendable, and adjustable. And each time it happened, I explained it away. They didn't mean it like that. They're just stressed. This isn't personal. Those explanations became reflexes. They allowed me to remain where I was without forcing change. And in fairness, staying quiet had always worked for me before. It kept the peace. It avoided conflict. It made life predictable. But predictability has a cost. I began noticing how often I adjusted myself to avoid inconvenience to others. I rearranged my schedule without comment. I delayed my own plans because something came up. I accepted last-minute requests as normal, even when they disrupted things I'd been looking forward to. No one forced me. No one threatened me. I volunteered compliance because it felt easier than asserting boundaries I wasn't sure I was allowed to have. Over time, my silence became part of the system. They learned that I would adapt, that I wouldn't object, that whatever decision they made, I'd find a way to make it work. And once that expectation sets in, respect doesn't erode. It dissolves. I remember one evening in particular. They were discussing a family gathering scheduled for a weekend I'd already mentioned I'd be busy. I waited for a pause, then quietly reminded them. There was a moment of surprise. "Oh, right," someone said. "Well, you can probably move your thing, right?" It wasn't framed as a question that required an answer. It was framed as a conclusion. I nodded. Of course I did. Later alone, I tried to understand why that moment stayed with me. It wasn't the request. It was the assumption that my commitments were provisional, optional until someone else's became more important. That's when it became clear to me. They didn't see my life as something with momentum, and I had helped create that image. By staying adaptable, I had taught them that my boundaries were negotiable. By never correcting their assumptions, I had allowed them to harden into beliefs. Not malicious beliefs, just convenient ones. There's a dangerous comfort in being needed, but not respected. Being needed gives you relevance. Being respected gives you agency. I had relevance without agency, and for a long time that felt like enough, until it didn't. What made this phase difficult wasn't pain. It was numbness. Disrespect that's normalized doesn't feel sharp. It feels dull. It settles into your routines, your language, the way you think about yourself. I stopped introducing ideas that might be ignored. I stopped sharing plans that might be questioned. I began shrinking my future to fit the space others had assigned me. And the worst part, no one noticed. Because from the outside, nothing was wrong. I was still reliable, still calm, still easy. If anything, I was praised more for how flexible I was. "You're so low maintenance," someone said once, smiling. I smiled back. That comment stayed with me longer than it should have. Low maintenance isn't a compliment when it's used to justify overlooking someone's needs. It's a label that makes neglect feel acceptable. Still, I didn't push back. I told myself I was choosing peace, that I was being mature, that asserting myself would only create unnecessary friction. But peace that requires you to disappear isn't peace. It's a quiet erosion. I began writing more in my notebook during this time. No plans yet. Observations, patterns, dates, who asked, who assumed, who decided. Not to build a case, but to stay honest with myself, because the truth was, no one was actively pushing me down. They were simply standing still while I slowly sank, and I was the one holding my breath. This was the stage where disrespect stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a climate. And once something becomes part of the atmosphere, you don't fight it. You either adapt or you leave. At the time, I didn't know which I would do. I only knew that staying quiet was no longer neutral. It was shaping the outcome whether I intended it to or not. There comes a moment when you realize you're no longer being misunderstood. You're being managed. It didn't happen all at once. There was no meeting, no announcement, just a gradual narrowing of how I was spoken to, what I was trusted with, and where I was expected to stay. My role had been decided, and it wasn't evolving. I was the dependable one, the filler, the person you call when something needs handling, but not when something needs imagining. They didn't say it directly, but their behavior said it consistently. This is where you belong. I noticed how often responsibility flowed downward, but authority never did. I could be tasked with coordinating things, but never shaping them. I could be given problems to solve, but I was never asked what problems should be addressed in the first place. Even my presence in the house reflected it. I had access, but not ownership. I was welcome, but not rooted. My space was functional, not personal, temporary, even though no end date had ever been discussed. And in quiet ways, I was reminded of that. A room reconfigured without asking me. Rules adjusted casually, as if they'd always existed. Conversations stopped when I entered, not because they were secret, but because they weren't meant to include me. That's when I understood. I wasn't overlooked by accident. I was being kept in a specific lane. Reliable, useful, invisible. The strange thing was how calm everyone seemed about it. There was no hostility, no tension. They weren't trying to hurt me. They simply couldn't imagine me outside the role they'd assigned. And because I hadn't challenged it early, it now felt natural to them. I saw it clearly one afternoon when someone joked, "Lucas would never leave. He's too comfortable here." They said it lightly, confidently. Everyone laughed. I did too, but inside something hardened, because comfort wasn't what kept me there. Familiarity was. Fear was. The quiet agreement I'd made with myself was that as long as I wasn't causing trouble, I was safe. But safety without dignity has an expiration date. I began noticing how the language around me subtly reinforced the role. He's good at helping. He doesn't need much. He's flexible. No one said he's building something. No one said he has plans. Not because they didn't care, but because the idea didn't fit. And I realized something else, just as important. Roles don't just limit how others treat you. They limit what you allow yourself to attempt. I had internalized the expectations. I hesitated before pursuing things that might disrupt the balance. I second-guessed ambitions that didn't align with how I was seen. I edited my own future to stay legible to them. That was the most dangerous part. Not the house, not the comments, but the slow alignment of my self-image with their assumptions. Still, I didn't confront anyone. Confrontation would have been emotional, reactive, loud, and something in me was shifting toward the opposite. I didn't want to argue my way out of a role. I wanted to outgrow it. So I started paying closer attention, not to what they said, but to what they needed from me, where they relied on my presence. What would change if I weren't there? Not as a threat, as information. Because once you understand the role you've been assigned, you also understand the leverage hidden inside it. At that point, I wasn't planning an exit. I wasn't building anything yet. I was still inside the structure. But now, I could see it clearly. And clarity changes how you stand in a room, even when you say nothing. The day everything shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no ultimatum, no dramatic line in the sand. It was an ordinary morning, framed by the same routines I'd been living inside for years. I was alone in the kitchen, drinking coffee that had gone cold because I'd forgotten about it. The house was quiet in that specific way that only happens when you're awake, before everyone else. When the space feels neutral, almost honest. On the counter was my notebook. I hadn't opened it intentionally. It was just there. I flipped through a few pages absently, reading things I'd written weeks earlier, dates, short sentences, observations without emotion attached to them, patterns. That's when it happened. Not as a thought, but as a realization that settled fully formed. No one here was going to change how they saw me. Not because they were cruel, not because they were selfish, but because there was no incentive to. The system worked for them. I handled what needed handling. I adjusted when plans changed. I stayed calm. I stayed available. From their perspective, nothing was broken. And then something inside me relaxed. That might sound strange, but it's true. The tension I'd been carrying wasn't anger. It was an expectation. The quiet hope that if I just waited long enough, someone would notice. That they'd see the effort. That they'd expand the role. Letting go of that hope felt like relief. Because once you accept that you won't be recognized where you are, you're free to stop auditioning. I closed the notebook and sat there longer than necessary. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel determined. I felt clear. I realized that the question wasn't, why don't they see me? Why am I still trying to be seen here? That reframing changed everything. From that moment on, my silence shifted from habit to choice. I stopped explaining myself internally. I stopped negotiating with imaginary versions of them who might suddenly understand. Instead, I began asking quieter, more useful questions. What do I control? What skills have I postponed developing because they didn't fit this environment? What would change if my future didn't require their approval? None of those questions demanded immediate action. They demanded patience. That day, I didn't announce anything. I didn't behave differently. I still helped, still nodded, still played the role. But the internal contract had been canceled. I wasn't waiting anymore. And when you stop waiting, time starts to feel different. Days stop blending together. Small opportunities become visible. Not because they appear suddenly, but because you're finally looking for them. I began protecting my attention in subtle ways, spending more time alone, saying less about my thoughts, observing without reacting. They didn't notice. Why would they? I looked the same. I sounded the same. I was still reliable. But reliability, when it's no longer fueled by attachment, becomes something else entirely. It becomes a strategy. That morning marked the end of something quiet but significant. The version of me that believed this place would eventually become more than it was. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt gratitude for the clarity, because clarity doesn't shout. It doesn't rush you. It simply waits until you're ready to move without needing permission. I didn't know yet what I would build. I only knew where I would no longer build it, and that was enough to begin. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before, it had been avoidance, a way to keep things smooth, to not draw attention, to survive inside a role that felt smaller than I was. Now it was intentional, measured, protective. I still spoke when necessary. I still responded politely. But I stopped filling space unnecessarily. I stopped offering explanations for decisions that didn't require approval. I let pauses exist. People often think silence is empty. It isn't. Silence is where you hear what others reveal when they assume you're not reacting. And they revealed more than they realized. They mistook my calm for complacency, my restraint for acceptance. Because nothing outward had changed, they assumed nothing inward had either. That misunderstanding gave me room. I began separating my energy carefully. What I gave to the household stayed consistent, enough to avoid suspicion, not enough to invite dependence. What I gave to myself increased. Late at night, I started learning. Quietly, methodically. No announcements, no enthusiasm was shared at the dinner table. Just focused attention directed somewhere that didn't involve them. I learned how money actually moved. Not in theory, in systems. How leverage worked. How small, consistent inputs could compound over time. How digital work didn't require permission or visibility to begin. During the day, I remained predictable. During the night, I became precise. They noticed I was quieter, but interpreted it in the safest way possible. He's tired. He's always been like that. He keeps to himself. No one asked what I was working on. No one imagined there was anything to ask. That was the advantage. Silence, when chosen, creates a symmetry. You know more than they do. You see further. And because you're not announcing your trajectory, no one tries to correct it. I also began practicing something else. Emotional non-reactivity. When comments landed awkwardly, I let them pass. When jokes brushed too close, I didn't stiffen. I observed the pattern instead of absorbing the sting, not because I was numb, but because I was no longer invested in changing their behavior. That detachment created a subtle shift in power. They felt it, even if they couldn't name it. Conversations changed tone. Assumptions became slightly less confident, but still, no one asked questions. They didn't see strategy. They saw withdrawal, and withdrawal, in their minds, confirmed the role. Quiet, limited, unambitious. I let them believe it. There's a misconception that growth requires visibility, that if you're doing something meaningful, people should notice. But some of the most decisive changes happen in conditions of near invisibility. I stopped sharing plans because plans invite opinions. I stopped sharing progress because progress invites comparison. I let my work remain unvalidated because I didn't need validation from a system I was exiting. What I needed was alignment. This phase wasn't exciting. It was repetitive, solitary, unimpressive from the outside, but it was stable. And stability, when you're rebuilding internally, matters more than excitement. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I was trying to build something that couldn't be taken away once it existed. That's the quiet advantage of silence as a choice. It denies others the opportunity to interfere. They continued living as if nothing had changed, as if I were still fully inside the structure, as if my future was still adjacent to theirs. But internally, I had already stepped outside, and from there the work became clearer. What they never noticed wasn't effort. It was a direction. From the outside, my days looked the same. Same wake-up time, same routine, same quiet presence moving through the house, fixing what needed fixing, staying out of the way when nothing did. But beneath that surface, everything had changed. I wasn't just learning randomly. I was documenting, tracking what worked, what didn't, treating my time like a resource instead of something that exists to be filled by other people's needs. The notebook stopped being a place for observations and became a place for systems. I wrote down skills I could build without credentials, ways value moved online without permission, how anonymity could be an advantage instead of a limitation. I wasn't chasing shortcuts. I was building foundations. Every night, I committed to small, repeatable actions, not because they felt meaningful in the moment, but because they accumulated quietly. They never saw that part. They didn't see me studying financial structures instead of scrolling. They didn't see me learning how to position work so it didn't rely on proximity or approval. They didn't see me designing an exit that didn't require conflict, because why would they look? In their minds, I was stable, contained, settled. That assumption gave me the most valuable thing a person in my position can have: time without scrutiny. I also began preparing in less visible ways. I reduced my footprint in the house. Fewer personal items, less emotional investment in shared routines. I started organizing documents, digitizing what mattered, separating what was mine from what wasn't. Not because I was planning to leave imminently, but because I was preparing to leave cleanly. I learned to think in terms of leverage instead of effort, where a small move could create a disproportionate impact, where dependence existed, where my absence would be felt, not emotionally, but structurally. And that's what people misunderstand about quiet preparation. It isn't fueled by anger, it's fueled by accuracy. I wasn't rehearsing speeches, I wasn't fantasizing about moments of recognition. I was making sure that when the time came, I wouldn't need to explain myself. What surprised me most was how invisible growth really is when no one is expecting it. They commented once that I seemed comfortable lately, that I'd settled into the role. I nodded, because comfort was what they understood. They didn't notice that my questions had changed, that I was no longer asking if something was possible, but how it scaled, that my focus had shifted from short-term stability to long-term autonomy. They didn't notice the discipline. Discipline doesn't announce itself. It doesn't ask for credit, it just repeats. I also stopped reacting emotionally to future talk. When they spoke about plans that didn't include me, I didn't feel the old tightening in my chest. I listened with the calm of someone whose future was no longer dependent on being included. That calm is deceptive. People assume you're at peace with your place when you're actually preparing to leave it entirely. Looking back, this was the most important phase. Not because of what I built externally, but because of what I stopped needing internally. I stopped needing their validation. I stopped needing clarity from them. I stopped needing a signal that it was okay to want more. All of that had been internal permission, and I had finally given it to myself. They never noticed the shift because it didn't disrupt their world, but it was quietly constructing mine. The reveal didn't happen in front of anyone. There was no moment where I leaned back in my chair and thought, I've made it. No surge of adrenaline, no urge to tell someone. It happened quietly, the way most real turning points do, when enough small confirmations align into something undeniable. I was reviewing numbers late one night. Nothing dramatic, just patterns on a screen and notes beside my notebook. I'd been doing this long enough that I wasn't guessing anymore. I was measuring. That's when I saw it. Not success on leverage. For the first time, I understood that what I was building didn't require proximity. It didn't require permission. And most importantly, it didn't require me to stay where I was out of fear. The realization was calm, almost clinical. If I stopped tomorrow, the system would still function. If I left quietly, nothing would collapse on my side. If I needed space, I could afford it, emotionally and practically. That was the reveal. Not that I was winning, but I was no longer trapped. I sat there longer than necessary, not celebrating, not smiling, just letting the clarity settle. Because clarity, once it arrives, changes how you interpret everything that came before it. The comments, the assumptions, the role. They hadn't limited me. They had distracted me. And now, the distraction was gone. What surprised me was how little I wanted to share it. There was no urge to correct anyone's perception. No desire to rewrite the narrative in real time. I didn't want recognition. I wanted completion. I understood then why so many transitions fail. People announce them too early. They invite opinion into something that isn't finished. They look for acknowledgement before stability. I didn't. I treated the reveal like a private contract with myself. Evidence that my patience hadn't been misplaced. That the silence had served a purpose. From that point on, my behavior became even more controlled. I didn't change routines. I didn't hint at plans. I didn't withdraw dramatically. I simply stopped imagining futures that involved staying. That internal shift affected everything. When requests came in, I evaluated them differently. Not emotionally, structurally. Did this increase dependence? Did it cost more than it returned? Did it assume permanence? If it did, I adjusted. They still didn't notice, because from their perspective, nothing had changed. The house still ran. I still helped. I still nodded. But now, there was a clear endpoint in my mind. Not a date, but a condition. When preparation is complete, action becomes inevitable. The reveal wasn't exciting, it was grounding. It told me that I could move when I chose. Not in reaction, not in anger, not under pressure, but deliberately. And once you know that, the waiting stops feeling heavy. It starts feeling strategic. The decision didn't arrive with urgency. It arrived as a comparison. Once you know you can leave, staying becomes a choice. And every choice invites evaluation. I began noticing the contrast between the life I was quietly building and the life I was still maintaining. One expanded me, the other kept me useful. And the gap between them was growing. I didn't rush to act. I laid out the options carefully, the way you do when you don't want to confuse impulse with clarity. Option 1 was the most familiar. Stay longer, continue preparing, accumulate more margin, avoid disruption. This option came with comfort and approval, but at the cost of time. Option 2 was partial departure. Reduce involvement, renegotiate boundaries, test independence, without fully committing to it. This option sounded reasonable on paper, but it required conversations I knew would be misunderstood. It would turn a quiet transition into a negotiation. Option 3 was clean separation. No arguments. No explanations that invited debate. No gradual withdrawal that allowed others to reassert expectations. Just a decisive shift from inside the structure to outside it. That option carried the most uncertainty, but the least distortion. I thought carefully about what each path would require emotionally. Not logistically, emotionally. Staying would require continued self-suppression. Renegotiating would require emotional labor and justification. Leaving would require resolve, but not explanation. That was the deciding factor. I didn't want to defend my growth to people who hadn't noticed it. I didn't want to be convinced to stay smaller for the sake of comfort. And I didn't want to leave in a way that created unnecessary damage. So I chose the irreversible option, not dramatically, but firmly. I decided that when I moved, it would be forward only. No fallback, no lingering dependency, no need to be understood. That decision changed my posture immediately. Not externally, internally. I stopped imagining, what if I stay a bit longer? I stopped adjusting plans to account for their reactions. I wasn't angry with them. That mattered to me. Anger creates noise. Noise invites interference. I wanted my exit to be clean, quiet, and complete. Once the decision was made, everything else became procedural. Preparation had a new purpose. Timelines tightened, loose ends became visible. I began treating my presence there as temporary, because now it truly was. They didn't sense the decision. People rarely do. Decisions made without emotional charge don't broadcast themselves. But I felt it constantly, not as pressure, as alignment. For the first time, my actions pointed in one direction only, and that direction didn't require consensus. It required execution. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel lighter. I felt quieter. There's a difference. Lightness comes from release. Quiet comes from focus. I wasn't celebrating freedom yet. I was executing a transition that needed to be invisible until it was complete. I moved carefully, not because I was afraid of being stopped, but because I understood how easily intentions can be distorted once they're noticed. The first changes were administrative, boring, intentional. I separated finances cleanly. Accounts that had once overlapped out of convenience were closed or redirected. Subscriptions were moved, addresses updated. Nothing dramatic, just a steady unwinding of entanglement. I handled documents the same way. Everything important was duplicated, stored securely, and removed from shared spaces. Not hidden, just no longer accessible by accident. At the same time, I reduced dependency in ways that looked natural. I was busy more often, less available for spontaneous requests. Still helpful, but no longer instantly adjustable. They interpreted it as personal growth within the role. "That's good," someone said once. "You're finally focusing on yourself a bit." I nodded. They didn't realize what a bit meant. I found a place quietly. Nothing impressive, just functional, neutral mine. I didn't rush to furnish it emotionally. A bed, a desk, space to think. I moved items slowly, in small batches. Nothing triggered questions. Each trip lightened my footprint in the house until my presence there was mostly operational. Through all of this, my behavior stayed consistent. Calm, polite, predictable. That's the thing about moving in silence. It requires discipline. You don't get to act out relief. You don't get to telegraph intention. You finish first, then you breathe. What surprised me was how much space appeared once I stopped announcing myself internally. When you're no longer performing a role, even silently, your energy reallocates itself. I slept better. I thought more clearly. I reacted less. They still didn't notice. They couldn't imagine a version of me that didn't orbit their structure. And imagination is often the limiting factor in how people perceive risk. From their perspective, nothing was wrong. The system still worked. I still showed up. I still solved problems. But the truth was, I was already gone in every way that mattered. The last thing I did was the hardest. Not practically, but emotionally. I stopped feeling responsible for outcomes that weren't mine anymore. That shift didn't show, but it mattered. Because when the moment came, and it would, I wouldn't hesitate. I wouldn't backtrack. I wouldn't explain. I would simply step out of a structure I had already exited internally, and they would only notice once the silence changed shape. The consequences didn't announce themselves either. They arrived the same way everything else had, quietly, indirectly, through absence rather than confrontation. At first, it showed up as an inconvenience. Something didn't get done on time. A routine slipped. A small problem lingered longer than usual. No one panicked. They assumed it was temporary, that I was busy, that I'd get to it later. I watched this from a distance, not physically, but emotionally. I was still present, still responsive, but no longer compensating preemptively. I let small gaps remain unfilled. And gaps, when they persist, reveal structure. They started checking in more often. "Did you see this? Can you handle that today? When you have a minute?" The tone hadn't changed, but the frequency had. I answered calmly. Sometimes yes, sometimes later, sometimes not at all. Nothing dramatic, just reasonable boundaries applied consistently. That consistency unsettled them more than resistance would have. Because resistance invites debate. Consistency forces adaptation. They began stepping into tasks they'd long delegated without thinking. They discovered that what I'd been handling quietly actually required attention, time, follow through. It wasn't painful yet, just uncomfortable. Then came the assumptions breaking down. Plans were made that depended on my availability, and for the first time, I didn't adjust. I stated conflicts simply, without apology. The room paused longer than usual. "Oh," someone said. "Okay, we'll figure something out." They weren't upset, just surprised. Surprise turned into recalibration. They started coordinating more, asking questions they'd never asked before, trying to understand logistics they'd never needed to. Not because they missed me, but because they missed the stability I provided. That distinction matters. I noticed something else during this phase. They still didn't connect these changes to my leaving. Their minds went everywhere except that possibility. People rarely anticipate loss when it's been normalized away. From their perspective, I was still part of the environment, a constant. You don't prepare for the floor to disappear under something you assume is load-bearing. And I didn't correct them. I didn't hint. I didn't warn. Warnings feel generous, but they often delay inevitability and invite pressure. I wasn't interested in being persuaded to stay functional for the sake of comfort. What surprised me most was my own reaction. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel guilty. I felt observant. I saw clearly how much invisible labor I'd been carrying, not because it was impossible for them to do, but because it had been convenient for them not to. And now, without that convenience, the system felt different. More effort, more coordination, more friction. Nothing was broken, but nothing was smooth. And smoothness, I realized, had been my contribution all along. As the days passed, the adjustments continued. More check-ins, more last-minute reshuffling. Small signs of strain, not emotional, but operational. Still, no one asked the obvious question, because asking it would require acknowledging something they hadn't imagined, that I was no longer oriented towards staying. An orientation once changed doesn't reverse. I stayed calm, I stayed polite, I stayed detached. The consequences had begun, not as punishment, not as collapse, but as a quiet reckoning with absence. And absence, unlike conflict, cannot be argued with. The moment they realized something was wrong didn't come with drama. It came with urgency, not the loud kind, the strained, inefficient kind that appears when systems start failing quietly, and no one knows exactly why. Schedules became reactive, conversations grew shorter, decisions that used to happen smoothly now require backtracking. I could feel it in the way they spoke to each other, clipped, uncertain, slightly rushed. They were no longer assuming things would work out. They were trying to make them work. That's when the questions started changing. Can you do this, but are you available? Not when you get a chance. But we really need this handled. There was a new tone underneath the words. Concern. Someone finally asked me, half jokingly, "You're not planning on disappearing on us, are you?" I looked up, met their eyes, and smiled lightly. "No," I said, "I've just been busy." It wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. From that point on, they tried to stabilize things. They offered small gestures, appreciation that arrived late, flexibility that had never been extended before. There were subtle attempts to pull me back into the center of things. "We really rely on you. You're such a big help around here. We don't know what we'd do without you." Those words would have mattered once. Now they sounded like inventory checks. They weren't seeing me. They were seeing the cost of my absence. That distinction became painfully clear when someone suggested making things more official. More structure, more responsibility, no mention of autonomy, no mention of growth, just reinforcement of the role with better language. It was too late. You can't renegotiate a position once the other person has already decided to leave it. Any attempt to do so feels like containment, not collaboration. What struck me most was the lack of curiosity. No one asked what I wanted. No one asked what I was building. No one asked why I seemed different. They were trying to restore a function, not understand a person, and that told me everything I needed to know. I stayed calm. I stayed respectful. I didn't correct assumptions or offer reassurance. I didn't escalate or withdraw dramatically. I simply didn't reattach, because reattachment would have meant abandoning the clarity I'd earned. At this stage, their concern turned into something close to panic. Not emotional panic, but logistical. They began exploring alternatives, talking about outsourcing, rearranging responsibilities. They were preparing too late for a system that no longer included me. And here's the quiet truth. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt distance, not coldness, distance. The kind that comes when you've already stepped into a future that no longer overlaps with your past. They were trying to fix what they thought was breaking. What they didn't realize was that nothing was breaking. It was ending, and endings, once internally complete, cannot be reversed by urgency. The conversation happened on an ordinary evening. No one sat me down formally. No one raised their voice. It began the way many things had in that house. Indirectly, cautiously, as if circling a truth everyone could feel but no one wanted to name. Someone asked if I had a minute. We stood in the living room, the same space where so many decisions had been made without me. The tone was careful, concerned, slightly strained. They asked how I was doing. I answered honestly but simply, "I'm good." There was a pause, the kind that waits for elaboration. I didn't add any. Finally, one of them said it, not accusing, just uncertain. "You've seemed different lately." I nodded. "I am." That was it. No defense, no explanation. They asked if something was wrong, if they'd done something, if there was a problem, they needed to fix it. I shook my head. "No," I said, "nothing's wrong." That answer confused them more than anger would have, because people understand conflict. They don't understand a resolution that doesn't involve them. I told them calmly that I was moving out, that I had already found a place, that I would be gone within the month. No long build-up, no dramatic reveal, just information. The room went quiet. They asked why, not sharply, almost gently, and this was the only moment where I chose my words carefully. "I've outgrown this place," I said, "and I don't think staying longer would be honest, for you or for you." There was no accusation in that sentence, no blame, just a fact. They tried to reassure me, told me I was valued, that they appreciated everything I did. Those things could change if I stayed. I listened. I believed they meant it, but meaning it now wasn't the same as seeing it before. I thanked them, genuinely, for the time, for the space, for what the arrangement had been when it worked. I didn't argue when they minimized. I didn't correct the narrative. I didn't explain the years of silence, the small cuts, the normalization. Explanations invite debate. Debate invites erosion. I wasn't there to convince them. I was there to inform them. The conversation ended without anger, without tears, without resolution in the way stories usually frame it. But there was something else in the room, a recognition that a line had been crossed long ago, and that we were only now standing at the visible edge of it. I walked away from that conversation calm, not because I didn't feel anything, but because nothing inside me was unresolved anymore. I don't tell this story from a place of triumph. There was no dramatic arrival on the other side, no applause waiting when I closed that door for the last time. Just quiet. The honest kind. The first weeks on my own were simple, sparse, intentional. I didn't rush to fill the space with distractions or explanations. I let it stay empty long enough for me to hear myself again. What surprised me wasn't how capable I felt. It was how unburdened. I wasn't managing perceptions anymore. I wasn't anticipating needs that weren't mine. I wasn't editing my future to fit into someone else's comfort zone. For the first time in a long while, my energy moved forward instead of outward. I kept working, steadily, quietly, but now the work belonged to me completely. The systems I'd built didn't feel abstract anymore. They felt grounded, real, responsive to my decisions instead of my availability. I didn't become louder. I didn't become harder. I became clearer. My identity stopped being defined by how useful I was to others and started being defined by what I was building for myself, not in opposition to anyone, just in alignment with my own standards. Occasionally, I thought about them, not with resentment, with distance. I could see now how easy it is to mistake reliability for permanence, how comfort dulls curiosity. How don't they question systems that serve them? I don't fault them for that, and I don't credit myself with moral superiority. What changed wasn't my worth. It was my positioning. I learned that silence is powerful only when it's chosen, that patience compounds only when it's paired with direction, that leaving doesn't require anger, only honesty. Today when people meet me, they don't see the version of me that existed in that house. They see someone steady, reserved, unhurried. They don't know where I came from, and I don't rush to tell them, because my story isn't something I carry as proof. It's something I carry as orientation. I know now that I don't need to be seen immediately to be building something meaningful. I don't need validation to proceed. And I don't need to explain my growth to people who only noticed me when I started leaving. That understanding is quiet, but it's permanent. There's a certain kind of story people expect at the end of journeys like this. They expect confrontation. They expect victory. They expect someone to be proven wrong. But real endings are usually quieter. Nothing collapsed when I left. The world didn't correct itself in dramatic fashion. People adjusted. Life moved on. And that in itself was the lesson. Because the point was never to punish anyone. The point was to stop participating in a version of myself that no longer fit. What this experience taught me, slowly, patiently, is that being underestimated isn't a curse. It's a condition. And like any condition, it only holds power as long as you live inside it. When people tell you who you are through their assumptions, they're not always trying to limit you. Often, they're just protecting the version of reality that works for them. But that doesn't mean you're obligated to remain in it. Silence doesn't mean submission. Patience doesn't mean permission. And loyalty doesn't require self-erasure. Sometimes, the most honest thing you can do is leave without burning anything down. Build quietly. Move deliberately. Let outcomes replace explanations. I didn't succeed because I proved them wrong. I succeeded because I stopped needing to be understood by people who benefited from misunderstanding me. If there's a moral here, it's this. Pay attention to where you're only valued for what you provide, not for who you are becoming. Those places are often stable, comfortable, familiar, and they can keep you there forever if you let them. Before you go, I want to leave you with a question, not as a challenge, but as an invitation to reflect. Where in your life are you being appreciated for your reliability, but quietly discouraged from outgrowing the role you were assigned? If this story resonated with you, I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not to agree with me, but to share what silence has taught you. Sometimes the most important shifts don't need witnesses. They just need honesty.
Cảm ơn các bạn vì đã theo dõi đến cuối. Đừng quên ấn like, share và bật chuông để không bỏ lỡ những video mới nhất nhé. Hẹn gặp lại.